Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, October 20th. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing, making beer at home. With this week, kegging. We talked with our good buddy Andy Sparks of the Home Brewery about saying bye-bye to the bottle, at least if you want to. Using kegs is one way to serve up your favorite brew. But first, I want to thank everyone who wrote in questions for David Logston of Y East. As I produce this, I just got off the phone with Dave not too long ago, and I think you'll be excited about our talk about all the things having to do with yeast. It was a very interesting and very long conversation. And now the hard part, I've got to decide how I'm going to serve up our chat to you on the show. It may take 2 or 3 episodes to run all we talked about. So I'm really grateful to Dave Logston for all the time he took with me on the phone. And once again, I'm grateful for all the questions from our listeners who wrote in. Very exciting stuff. Before we get any further, I want to remind you that if you click on the banner ad for Brew Your Own magazine on our basicbrewingradio.com site, you can sign up for a free issue. And if you decide to subscribe after that issue, you'll be helping to support this podcast. Well, now let's look into the mailbag. Dan from New Jersey writes in to ask a question about dry hopping. Dan was going to use a bag to put his hops into the secondary fermenter, but after hearing our interview with Gerard Lemons a few weeks ago, he decided to drop the hops directly in. Now, he wants to know how to avoid clogging his racking tube when it comes time to bottle. Dan asks if he can use cheesecloth and a rubber band to cover the end of the tube to ask as a filter, and whether that would aerate the beer too much. Well, I don't know if I'd worried about aeration, but I would be concerned about sanitation. You want to make sure the rubber band didn't come out of the yard from the morning paper. Any equipment that comes in contact with the beer needs to be sanitized. I've seen metal mesh filters for sale on some websites that are designed for this purpose. However, the sites say not to use them with plastic because they may scratch plastic surfaces, making them hard to sanitize. I guess you could use a short length of copper to put the metal filter on, then plug the copper into your plastic hose. I've read others use those stainless steel scrub pads to stick on the end of hoses and racking wands to filter out hops and trub. But again, you'd want to use a new one and sanitize. And don't use the ones with the soap built in. That wouldn't be good. I want to say thanks to David in Honolulu who sent in advice to help Greg with his question on brewing in our 50th state. David also uses ice in a cooler to help bring the temperature down of his fermenting beer, and I forwarded that information directly to Greg. I want to say howdy to Johan in Sweden. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Johan he's listening to the podcast now. I just think it's cool. We've got listeners around the world. Johan's getting started brewing with our DVD. Jay from Fayetteville, Arkansas, here in our neighborhood, here in Northwest Arkansas, also got our DVD and asks if there are any benefits to aging in a bottle rather than in a keg. Well, I think we answer that question fairly well with today's show, but the main advantages to bottling, in my opinion, are portability and cost. You don't have to buy kegging equipment or recharge CO2 bottles, but there are also advantages to kegging, and you'll hear those in just a moment. You'll be able to make up your own mind which you like better. And since we're talking about kegging, let's get on to talking about kegging. We recently joined Andy Sparks in the back of his homebrew shop to get an overview of the way to kick the bottle habit.
It's great to be here again, James. Anytime you want to get together and talk about beer and brewing, it's fine with me.
Well, great, especially if we can drink some beer.
Yeah, sure.
And we have been drinking some beer. We're drinking now my California Common, which, cheers.
Cheers.
I think it's one of my favorite beers that I've ever done.
Well, it's a delicious beer. It's a unique beer style that we can't talk about it and use the word steam when we refer to it anymore because of anchor steam. That's trademarked. But we all know what we're drinking. It's a classic beer from the early times before Prohibition when they were able to make beer with flavor. So.
And it's made with a lager yeast, but it's fermented at ale temperatures.
Exactly. Sometimes referred to as a cream ale, but typically now it's referred to as California Common. And it's usually got a little bitterness to it. It's usually clear or kind of straw colored. Has a hop aroma and character. It's a delicious beer.
Well, thank you. And if you were to actually lager this beer, you'd get probably a drier taste than what we're having here. This is fruitier.
Yeah, that's the thing. The warm temperatures bring out the fruitiness in the yeast and some of the higher alcohols, but that's part of what I think makes it taste good. Is it has more flavor profile, maybe richer flavor profile.
And I had the pleasure of trying a beer that you've made recently, and it was a wheat beer made with Amarillo hops. And you didn't want to talk about it because it doesn't exactly stay within the guidelines of a wheat beer. But you know.
Well, that's true. It's technically it's an American wheat beer, so I have a little leeway with the hops. But I was definitely trying to drive the hop character up. We got some new hops in. That's a new type of hops that's just become available to homebrew shops around the country, called Amarillo, and it's definitely got a pronounced citrus character to it, similar to Cascade, another American hop. But a lot of times people describe Cascade as being have a citrus character, orange kind of character. A lot of people describe these Amarillos as having almost a grapefruit character, and I lovingly call this American wheat beer grapefruit juice because it has it definitely has an aroma of Amarillo hops. So it's interesting.
To me, and it's a great beer, and
thank you.
But Amarillo hops, they're kind of the hot thing now, aren't they?
They are. They're actually right now they're almost impossible to get. They should the hop the crop is just coming in now, and they have boosted the production of Amarillo because they were so popular last year and had sold out. Most places that carried it had sold out. So they should have it in the market, and we will have it here at the home brewery.
Well, I can't wait, because if I can make something like that beer that you made, I want to make it. And, you shouldn't be embarrassed about not staying within the style guidelines, Andy.
You got to push the limit.
That's brewing beer is all about being creative and breaking the rules every now and then.
Sometimes you got to break the rules.
There you go. But we're not here to talk about our beers, although, we could talk about our beers all day.
For sure.
We're here to talk about what we do with our beers after they're fermented, and usually bottling. I've always been a bottler.
Yeah, that's where everybody starts. It's the easy way to start with bottles. But we're going to talk today about how to keg your home brew, and it makes it a little easier in some ways because you just have one big bottle to clean. But it does require additional equipment and some additional steps in cleaning and getting ready. So, there's some give and take. But most of the advanced homebrewers nowadays keg their beer just because it gets you from the fermenter to the glass a little faster. So,
let's talk about the advantages of why you would want to use a keg. Like you just said, right after it comes out of the fermenter, it goes in the keg and it's ready to drink right there?
Well, almost. We talked in one of the earlier episodes about, single stage versus double stage or two-stage fermentation. After your beer has cleared in your secondary fermenter, or if you're using a single stage, you've just given it plenty of time to clear, then you can rack it into a clean keg. And what we use in homebrewing is empty soda syrup canisters. These are the ones that Pepsi and Coke have used for years, and they pretty much have gotten out of the business of using these stainless kegs.
It's called a Cornelius keg, right?
Exactly.
Or a corny keg.
Corny keg. And they basically stopped using them. They've gone to a bag in the box, kind of a syrup solution. So these are available. And the nice thing about them is they are stainless, which means they can be thoroughly cleaned and sanitized. The other nice thing is they hold exactly 5 gallons, which happens to be what we make every time we brew.
Mm-hmm.
So they work really nicely for home brewing. But the big advantage to kegging is it's one bottle to clean. That's usually the biggest headache for home brewers is bottling. You have a lot of bottles. You're going to make a 5-gallon batch will make about 2 cases of beer, sometimes a little more. And that's a lot of bottles to scrub and clean. And when you go to bottle it, it's each bottle has to be filled and capped, filled and capped, filled and capped. It takes a while. It's not hard to do, but it's one of the things that is a little more troublesome and takes a little time, and usually is the thing that people dislike the most about the hobby. With kegging, you have one vessel. It's easy to clean. You can get your whole arm down inside it, scrub it out, take it apart. It's stainless, so you know it's sanitizable. But that's the real benefit to it.
And after you put the beer in the keg, how soon after you keg it can you start kegging it?
The way I normally do it, there's a couple different ways, but we'll talk about this way first. Is after you get your beer in cleared in your secondary fermenter, you'll rack or siphon your beer down into a clean and sanitized or sterilized. Really sanitized. Sterilizing would imply like an autoclave or something, but a sanitized keg. Then I usually put the lid on it, and I use a little CO2 to purge off any oxygen that's left inside the keg with the beer, and then I refrigerate it. And I usually leave it in the refrigerator overnight to drive the temperature down to somewhere in the low 40s. I want to get it good and cold, and that has to do with the rate at which CO2 dissolves into solution. If a beer that's cold will absorb more CO2 than a beer that's warm. So if you're trying to get CO2 into your beer to carbonate it, it's easier to do if it's cold. So the step is to fill your keg, seal it off, purge off any additional oxygen with CO2, and then stick it into a refrigerator, get it cold, and it takes a day for that, and then I take it out, and I'll hook it up to a CO2 tank. And there's a couple different methods for doing this. There's one where you can actually calculate how much pressure to put it on, and leave it under that pressure for a specified amount of time, and eventually the CO2 will dissolve in to solution based on the pressure gradient and the time. But I don't do that. What I do is I simply turn the pressure up on the CO2 to 15, 20 pounds of pressure, and then I start to rock the keg back and forth. And when you do that, you'll hear the CO2 start to dissolve into solution. Actually, you just hear it hiss into the bottle, into the keg, and it just kind of makes a slight hissing sound. But if you stop shaking the keg, the hissing sound will go away, and that's an indication that as you rock it, you're dissolving the CO2 into solution, making room for more CO2 to come into the keg. And I'll rock it back and forth for 15, 20 minutes, about as long as I can stand. It gets kind of old, and then I unhook it. Now you've basically got a keg full of carbonated beer, but it's also been shaken for about 20 minutes. So I usually stick it back in the refrigerator and let it calm down overnight. The next day I'll get a beer glass and take a tap over to the keg and snap it on and pour myself a glass. And sometimes it's just right. Sometimes it needs a little extra boost of CO2, in which case I'll do a little more of the rocking back and forth under pressure. But usually it only takes one or two small sessions and it's ready to drink. And that's the real nice thing about kegging, is that you don't have to wait for it to prime in the bottle, which usually takes a good couple weeks.
So there's no adding of the priming sugar
right.
with the
kegging. I want to make it clear, though, that some people do prime their beer naturally in kegs. So some people will add corn sugar to a keg, and instead of doing the method that I just described, shaking it and dissolving the CO2 into solution, they'll do it like a giant beer bottle, and or a naturally carbonated beer, and they'll put a measured amount of corn sugar into the keg and then let it sit for a few weeks. You have to leave it out at room temperature so that it can have another little fermentation. It will carbonate the beer, and then you're ready to chill it and serve it. The one thing I will note, that if you do naturally carbonate your keg beer, you'll want to take the dip tube, and we're going to talk about the parts of the keg in a minute, but there's a long stainless steel tube that goes all the way to the bottom of a keg. This is the true one. Big kegs you see in restaurants, or even these little corny kegs that we're using here. But what you'll want to do if you're going to naturally carbonate your beer is take the long dip tube out and take a hacksaw and cut off about a ½ inch of the long dip tube, because what's going to happen is you're going to get some yeast that forms on the bottom of your keg, and that'll help you keep from sucking that yeast up into the glass every time you go to serve a beer. And which, it just makes for a more presentable product. So if you're going to naturally carbonate, you probably want to shorten your dip tube a little bit.
Now, is there a difference in the character of the beer if you do the natural carbonation and if you do the forced carbonation?
Well, it depends who you ask. Some people really feel strongly that natural carbonation is the only way to go and that it's a much finer product. I have trouble telling the difference between one that's been charged with CO2, had the CO2 forced into it, or whether it's naturally carbonated. I think the truth is it's CO2 dissolved into solution is what you're tasting, and the method of doing that is probably incidental. But some people feel very strongly about that, and it's something that I know you've found in this hobby, that a lot of different ways of doing things, and everybody has an opinion. Most of their opinions are pretty strong. So
now the beer that you force carbonate, it still has yeast in it in suspension, so it's still going to do a bit of conditioning over time.
Sure. Your beer will still condition, although when you keg, you tend to, since you immediately chill the beer for pre-charging, pre-carbonating, you chill it and then you stick it in the fridge after you carbonate it. The amount of conditioning it can do is relatively minor because the yeast is all falling out of solution pretty readily. And excuse me, I've got a call.
Live radio, live-ish radio. Well, if you had a lager, say,
sure,
you would probably get more benefit out of conditioning
right
in the cooler temperatures of the fridge.
The other issue about conditioning and kegs, and this is something that I've found out of personal experience, is that when you have kegged beer around, you tend to go and have a half a glass of beer pretty much any time you want instead of having to open a whole nother beer. So I don't find a problem with beer lasting very long in the keg. It doesn't ever condition very much. It usually just gets drank up. So
well, that was one of my questions, is that if you've got a keg full of beer, to use that keg again, you've got to drink all that beer. Whereas if you do bottles, you can kind of archive some bottles. You can set some bottles down in the cellar or whatever, and you can have those for later on. So maybe if you want to archive a beer, you do the bottling, and maybe if you want to have a beer that you want to just enjoy the way it is and do it in a hurry, you can do the keg.
Sure, you can do that. The thing about archiving a beer, and a lot of people that, like you say, want to archive away a beer or two, or maybe want to enter contests, which also require bottled beer.
Mm-hmm. Can't send a keg to a contest.
Well, there are some contests that you do send a keg to.
Can we have one?
Yeah. Send your keg to us. But most of the time, what people do, that the homebrewers that keg their beer mostly, there's still some of them that enter contests regularly. And there's a couple techniques for doing that. And one is to use a special piece of equipment called a counter pressure bottle filler. And it allows you to, it's basically a small bottling plant. It's a couple little pieces of equipment that allow you to pressurize a bottle and then push the beer into it under pressure. It's a pretty difficult little piece of apparatus to master and to do well. I've found, and some of my friends that are professional or certified beer judges have found, is that you really can do a pretty good job by simply chilling the bottles before you use them, and you chill your beer and get it carbonated in the keg, and then simply pour the cold beer into a cold bottle, and as it starts to foam out the top, cap it, and that little bit of foam will cause any oxygen to be pushed out, and then when it settles back, leave you an appropriate headspace. And the beer's still carbonated, you've sealed it in the bottle, so now it's okay. And I've had friends win ribbons that beer came out of kegs, and they just bottled it up that way. And they've, used that method as well to take beers to friends and stuff. So it is possible. If you want to bottle up a couple bottles, you can take a couple bottles of beer out of your keg and cap them up and use them later.
Well, let's talk about are you ready to talk about the piece of equipment itself?
Sure.
Let's move on. What are the parts?
Okay, well, when you get your your corny keg, and I'm sure everybody knows what we're talking about because you've seen them behind fast food restaurants for years, and that's not where I'd suggest you get yours from. I would suggest you get yours from a reputable source. And they are fairly inexpensive nowadays because Pepsi and Coke aren't using them so much anymore. They're pretty easy to come by, and so I would definitely say try to do the honest thing and get it the right way. And
there may be some safety issues as well.
Exactly. You want to get one from a reputable source that's maybe checked all the parts and made sure that they're all still safe. You don't want to put too much pressure on these things, but they are something that will be under pressure, and you want to make sure that it all works. But basically, when you look at your keg, it's going to have kind of rubber handles on the top. It's a cylinder of stainless steel, and there'll be a little lid on the top, and then two places where you can connect the spigot and little couplings. There's two types of kegs. There's one called ball lock and one called pin lock. And those have to do with these little protruding connections. The pin lock is the Coke style, and they have small pins that when you put the adapter on that connects to your tap or your CO2 tank, it has some pins that allow you to key the thing on, twist it, and it locks the thing in place. The Pepsi ones are called ball lock, and they simply use like a quick disconnect with some ball bearings, and those are the preferred keg to use. Almost everybody uses the ball lock ones just because they are a little easier to disconnect and work with, and because they become the most popular, it seems to be the one that you can get the parts for the easiest. But on the top there is a lid that has a handle, and in the middle of the handle is a small pressure relief valve. Okay, and when you go to use a keg and you want to open it up, it's extremely important that you go ahead and pull the pin and allow it to vent whatever pressure is in the keg. You don't want to try and pull the door open or this lid open with it under pressure. You probably couldn't get it open because the lid will be forced closed by the pressure of the keg. But still, you don't want to be messing with it. You want to go ahead and vent off the pressure with the little pull valve. Sometimes it's a little rocker valve that you can rock back and forth to vent the pressure with. But once you do that, you can flip the little handle, and then you will push the lid down into the keg, twist it to the side, and lift it out. You'll find that it has a rubber O-ring around the base of it. This rubber O-ring, if your keg has been used for soda pop, especially things like Dr. Pepper or root beer, things that are very pungent, you'll want to replace all the rubber fittings in your keg because you'll be able to smell that smell, and you will be able to taste that in your beer when you get it done. So always look for that, and then replace any of the rubber O-rings and stuff that you find, especially if they were used in something. I think Sprite and stuff like that is pretty mild. You might be able to get away with that, but I typically just replace them all when I get a new keg or a used keg. So with that out, you can look down inside the keg, and you can see the long dip tube, and this is the dip tube that the beer will flow out of when you get the keg all put together. You'll see it sticking all the way down into the very bottom of the keg. What you can do is, depending on how the little the valves are attached, some are attached with a standard hex kind of bolt and or a nut, and then others have a small have a kind of a different star shaped one. Those require a special tool, but the ball locks normally have just a kind of a hex shaped nut on them that you can unscrew. So you want to take those apart, unscrew them, and when you do, you'll see the dip tube, the top of the dip tube, kind of sitting on top of the keg, and you can pull that out. And I always do this. I take both the dip tubes out. You'll find one is very long and curved and goes all the way to the bottom of the keg, and then there'll be a short one. Okay, the long one is the one that beer travels out when you dispense it. The short one is the one the gas goes into the keg on. So you'll take both of those out. You want to, after you get all the dip tubes out and all the valves off of it, now you just have basically a stainless steel cylinder. Now I clean this thoroughly. Try and get down in there with a brush and make sure it's thoroughly clean. Try to reach up underneath the lip and clean where the dip tubes come out, because that's a spot that can harbor grunge and stuff like that as well.
And again, it's essential that you sanitize this just as you would sanitize a beer bottle.
Exactly. Like so give it a good thorough washing. Don't be afraid to get a little soap in there. You don't want to use any cleaners that, floor cleaner or 409 or any of those things, but some mild dish soap on a scrubby pad. You never use steel wool on stainless steel. You will ruin your stainless steel if you do that. So use a plastic scrubby sponge or something, and go ahead and get it good and soapy, get it good and clean, and rinse it out good. And then when we get the keg all put back together, we will put a sanitizing solution in it and slosh it around really good, and then drain it out. And then I like to pour in a little bit of water from like bottled water or something like that, something that I know is good and clean, and push that out through the lines with the CO2, and that makes sure that any sterilant that got up into the dip tubes is purged from the keg as well. So let's talk a little bit about these little things called the poppet valves, and these are the valves that are on the very top, and these are the ones that we unscrew to get to the dip tubes. If you pull them off, they have a little, when you look at them, it's kind of a circle within a circle. And what you'll need to do is you'll actually have to set these on a table, and you'll have to use something like a screwdriver or something hard to push the little center of it out. And when you do, it'll pop out, and then what you'll find is a little spring-loaded valve that comes out the bottom. Okay, and this is the little poppet valve, and you can replace these. You can get these from most homebrew shops.
Do you need to replace them?
You need to replace them if the spring's bad, and what'll happen is they won't hold pressure anymore. And so if you get it all together and you put it under pressure, and you should do this, put it together, put some water in it, and try to put it under pressure and make sure water doesn't come leaking out of your valves before you fill it with beer. Because then it's too late. You've now filled it up with good beer and it's leaking out the sides, and now you have to muck about with it and try and get it into something else.
So test it.
So test it with water before you put your precious beer in it. But anyway, you want to pop those out, give them a good clean, and that's the real main thing is you want to be able to get, because this has got this spring in here, and grunge can get caught up in here, and just a rinsing won't get that out. So you want to pop those out, give it a good cleaning, get up in there with Q-tips, and clean these little valves out. I usually soak them and get any grunge all loosened up on them. But that's pretty much it. There's some, on the dip tubes, both dip tubes have a dip tube O-ring that will slide up and go up near the top, and that's one of the things that keeps it from, helps it hold pressure. But you just slide them back down into the keg, and then with your little poppet valves, you'll pop these things back down into the valves, and then you set them on top of the dip tube and screw them into place.
Now, you were looking at, there was a marking on one
right.
and not on the other. Is there an in valve and an out valve?
There sure is, and they are different. And I would, when you take your keg apart, note which ones they are. I had to run over and get another keg a second ago and just double check and make sure it's just like a carpenter. Measure twice, cut once. So yeah, what you'll find is there's some little notches usually on the nut part, the part you use to loosen it, and that's usually on the inside or the in valve. So, but the best thing to do is just to pay attention when you take it apart, and you won't have the same problem I have. So, but we'll just loosely fit those on there and twist them down.
So you're actually getting this keg ready for a
exactly. I have a beer at home that's ready to go. It's an American Brown with Amarillo hops in it as well. 7 hop additions. It's I'm quite proud of, and I'll probably dry hop it as well. So, but anyway, it should be a tasty one. And I'm getting the keg ready to take home and fill up tonight. So.
Well, hopefully I'll have a chance to taste that beer as well.
Oh, I'm sure you will, James.
Well, Andy, are there any parting words? Anything that we've forgotten to talk about with kegs?
Sanitize. Mm-hmm. That's everything. You want to make sure everything's good and clean, but the key point also is make sure you get all the sanitizer out. You certainly don't want to leave any sanitizer in the keg or in the lines that could affect the flavor of your beer. You don't want to be pouring a whole keg of beer out because it tastes like iodine or Clorox or whatever sanitizer you're using.
Good point. Well, again, wow. It sounds like we're getting a storm coming. That's good.
We need the rain for sure.
All right. Well, that's environmental radio here in the back of the shop. Well, Andy, thanks again for having us in your store, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Well, I'm sure we can. Thanks for having me on the podcast, James.
Thanks, Andy. And thanks again to Andy Sparks for all the help. You can visit Andy's homebrew store at thehomebrewery.com. That's thehomebrewery.com. And if you're unsure of what a corny keg looks like, look at the picture in the description of this week's episode on basicbrewingradio.com. Next week, the first part of our conversation with David Logston of Why Yeast. We dive deeply into the subject of yeast, and I hope we come up with the answers to many of your questions about our microscopic helpers. And if you hear jingling in the background, that's my dog Penny. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And if you're wanting to get into home brewing, while you're on our site, you can check out our DVD, Basic Brewing, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing. We'll walk you through the process step by step. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVD, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. Well, that's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.